Ireland can get very, very windy, and so it makes sense that the country has turned to wind in order to meet its renewable electricity targets. Wind power now accounts for a significant portion of Ireland's electricity generation. It's worth noting here that electricity is just one form of energy. Energy includes things like transport fuels and heating, while electricity is specifically the flow of electrical power. Therefore, wind makes up less of Ireland's energy supply than electricity supply. However, in 2020, wind generated 36.3% of Ireland's electricity demand, and the installed capacity continues to grow year on year. But there's a major problem. Wind, like solar, is intermittent. The wind doesn't always blow when we need it to, and this causes fluctuations in electricity supply that don't always match demand. This is important because electricity grids must balance supply and demand almost instantly. The grid frequency in Ireland is typically maintained between 49.9 Hz and 50.1 Hz. Frequency changes based on both the supply and the demand of electricity in the system, and this is true regardless of the energy source. If supply exceeds demand, frequency rises. You can think of this as too much energy pushing the system faster, whereas if demand exceeds supply, frequency drops, and you can think of this as the system not having enough energy and slowing down. If the frequency drops too low, it can lead to a blackout. Here, large portions of the grid collapse to avoid causing significant damage, such as transformers exploding or catching fire. In order to avoid this, safety systems automatically begin to shut down non-essential parts of the grid, a process called load shedding. If the shortage persists, operators may impose controlled, rolling blackouts, temporarily cutting power to different areas in rotation. So, apart from wind, what other options do we have? Well, one solution that has been overlooked by most, but championed by a few, is nuclear power, specifically nuclear fission. Some suggest that nuclear power is the obvious solution to Ireland's energy problems. It's relatively safe, it's clean, as in it doesn't produce CO2 or air pollution, and it's incredibly efficient, generating large amounts of reliable power around the clock, regardless of the weather. For a country like Ireland that's trying to meet ambitious climate goals and also increase its energy security, nuclear power offers a really compelling alternative. In the rest of this video, we'll look at the economics, the grid, and the real reasons why nuclear power just doesn't quite add up in Ireland, at least for now. To be clear, there are lots of reasons why nuclear energy isn't possible in Ireland right now, and I'll begin by addressing the issues that are often discussed. First, public opinion is split. For instance, a 2021 poll of 1,200 Irish people found that roughly 43% were in favour of introducing nuclear power in Ireland and 43% were opposed. Second, nuclear power has actually been banned under Irish law since 1999, and there doesn't seem to be any political appetite to change that in any of the major political parties. For instance, the Irish Minister for Finance, Paschal Donohoe, stated that nuclear-powered electricity generation plants are prohibited in Ireland, and the government has no plans to revisit the prohibition on nuclear-powered electricity generation. Third is the issue of waste. Nuclear waste is highly toxic due to being radioactive. Worse, this waste can have a half-life of up to 1 million years, meaning that it will take 1 million years for half of the radioactive material to decay, in other words, for it to lose its radioactivity, and another 1 million years for half of the remaining material to decay, and so on. As you can imagine, this means that it needs to be stored safely. Right now, Ireland has no long-term disposal facilities. A long-term disposal strategy would be needed in order for Ireland to adopt nuclear energy. Another two issues are the timeline and the cost of building a nuclear plant. Construction on these projects takes years, if not decades, to complete, and the projects often run over budget. The average time to build a power plant is around 7 years, although given Ireland's lack of experience building nuclear power plants, it's not unreasonable to assume it would take longer than average. And that's not even considering planning issues in Ireland. The bottom line is that even if we begin building a nuclear power plant today, it would not help us meet our short-term climate goals. But let's put all of that aside. Even if we wanted nuclear power, it still wouldn't work. And here's why. The overlooked problem with nuclear power in Ireland. Perhaps the biggest challenge for Ireland in transitioning to nuclear power right now lies within its grid infrastructure. To understand the scale of this issue, let's compare Ireland's grid to that of France, where nuclear energy makes up a major part of the energy mix. France has a much larger grid, with historical peak electricity demand reaching over 96,000 megawatts. Ireland's grid, on the other hand, is much smaller, reaching a historic peak of 6,024 megawatts on the 8th of January 2025. It makes sense that Ireland's grid is small. It's a small island nation with a population of just over 5.5 million people, compared to France's 66 million people. It's never going to have the same levels of electricity consumption as France. The major limitation for Ireland, though, is that unlike France, Ireland is not strongly interconnected with its neighbours' grids. If France's energy supply is too high, it can easily sell this energy to its neighbours, and if it's too low, it can easily buy energy from its neighbours, or at least more easily than Ireland can. And herein lies the issue with nuclear energy in Ireland. Nuclear power plants are massive. A typical nuclear power plant generates approximately 1,000 megawatts of electricity per reactor. So what's the problem? This sounds like a good thing. Just a few nuclear reactors could satisfy nearly all of Ireland's energy demand. Well, it all comes back to grid frequency. Let's start with an extreme example. Suppose Ireland had 5 1,000 megawatt reactors, meeting nearly all of its roughly 5,500 megawatt peak demand. If demand were to suddenly fall, these large, inflexible nuclear generators wouldn't be able to reduce output quickly enough to keep the grid frequency stable. Without adequate demand, or the ability to export this surplus power to neighbouring countries, the frequency would rise, potentially triggering emergency shutdowns or damaging infrastructure. In contrast, modern gas turbines or battery systems can ramp their output up or down much more quickly, making them better suited for maintaining grid stability in smaller, isolated systems like Ireland's. This kind of operational flexibility is crucial when there's limited capacity to import or export electricity. And it's not just a technical problem. The economics don't make sense here either. Nuclear power plants are designed to run at a constant output because that's when they're most efficient and cost effective. This is because they have an extremely high upfront construction cost, but a relatively low operating cost once they're up and running. This means that in order to make financial sense, they need to be generating electricity and selling it all the time. If Ireland were forced to regularly curtail nuclear output to protect grid stability, a lot of that potential energy would simply go to waste, and therefore the initial investment might never be recouped. Okay, so let's scale it back a bit. 5 nuclear reactors is clearly too many, but what about just one 1,000 megawatt reactor? Ireland's electricity demand is unlikely to ever fall below 1,000 megawatts. So why couldn't Ireland just use one nuclear reactor as a base load and then supplement it with other energy sources? It's because of something called the loss of largest infeed limit, and this comes from a basic rule in grid design known as the N-1 criterion. I know it sounds complicated, but the N-1 criterion just means that the grid should be able to keep working even if one major part of the system suddenly fails, be it a power plant, a transformer, or anything else. The loss of largest infeed part specifically deals with the biggest single generator connected to the grid. If the generator suddenly drops offline, the grid needs to be able to replace that lost power instantly to keep the frequency stable. Right now, Ireland's grid can only handle a loss of around 450 megawatts. So even if our hypothetical 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant was only ever running at half power, it would still exceed what the grid can safely lose without risking blackouts or other equipment damage. In theory, we could build backup gas plants that sit idle and only kick in if the nuclear reactor fails, but economically that just doesn't make any sense. You'd be building an entire second power system just to act as a safety net, one that might only be used a handful of times in decades. That's a huge cost for very little return. Some of you are probably ready to point out that small modular reactors solve exactly this problem. So, let's quickly address that. Small modular reactors, or SMRs, have been touted by some as the solution to most of nuclear power's problems. For instance, this article in the Irish Times claimed that it was time for Ireland to bite the bullet on nuclear energy and suggested that SMRs were the solution to our energy needs. There's just one small issue. As of now, no SMR has been deployed at a commercial scale. While there are several projects underway, they remain in the construction, planning, or testing phases. Although they may be viable and a great option to Ireland in the future, right now there is very little evidence that this is the case. Anyway, even if SMRs were ready to roll out tomorrow, the electricity that they produce would still probably be relatively expensive. This comes down to something called the levelized cost of electricity, or the LCOE. It's a way to measure how much it will cost, on average, to generate 1 unit of electricity over a plant's entire life, taking into account construction, fuel, maintenance, and shutdown. This is generally measured in dollars per megawatt. For renewables like wind and solar, the LCOE is really low. The initial investment required is not that high, and the marginal cost of electricity In other words, the cost to produce one extra unit of electricity is pretty much zero, because you don't have to pay for wind or sunlight, which is the fuel. The marginal cost of power in a coal power plant, on the other hand, is not zero, because you do have to pay for the coal, among other things. For nuclear power, the marginal cost of electricity is really low, because you get a lot of energy from just a small bit of uranium. But the initial investments are massive. Over the lifetime of the plant, the low marginal cost of energy somewhat makes up for the large upfront costs, but nuclear energy still has a high LCOE. In fact, as of 2024, it has one of the highest of all major energy sources. SMRs will possibly have an even higher LCOE than traditional large reactors. Even though they're smaller and cheaper to build up front, they also produce less power, and that means that those big fixed costs are spread over fewer units of electricity. The future of nuclear power in Ireland. Does this mean that nuclear power will never be part of Ireland's energy mix? Absolutely not, but it does mean that we're not quite ready yet. If you're in favour of nuclear power in Ireland, the priority shouldn't be calling for a new reactor today. That's putting the cart before the horse. First, we need to upgrade the grid. Only then would building a nuclear power plant even make sense. Luckily for those of you that want to see nuclear energy in Ireland, the grid is currently undergoing some of the necessary changes. A 700 megawatt interconnector between Ireland and France, called the Celtic Interconnector, is planned to undergo testing by 2026. There are also some pretty cool energy storage systems being developed to help with grid balancing. For example, pumped hydro storage works by using excess electricity, say from a particularly windy day, to pump water up a hill to a reservoir. When electricity is needed, the water is released downhill again through turbines to generate power. Unfortunately, even the best energy storage systems can only help so much. Ireland has recently experienced periods of weeks with very low wind generation, and most current storage solutions can only deliver a few hours or at most a couple of days of backup power. Scaling them up is technically possible, but it's extremely expensive and often comes with its own environmental trade-offs. For now, nuclear power in Ireland just doesn't make sense. It's not politically, technically, or economically feasible. Let me be clear, I am not saying that Ireland should not take the necessary steps to make it feasible. But as it stands, nuclear power just doesn't hold the answer to Ireland's energy needs. Whether you agree or disagree, let me hear your thoughts in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, it would really mean a lot. And if you want to be notified when we upload again, be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon.